The ground gives way not with drama, but with patience. It happens in a narrow excavation trench on the edge of a wind-scoured plateau, where the soil has been cut layer by layer for weeks until it begins to feel less like earth and more like memory compressed into dust. The workers notice it first as a change in texture. The sediment stops behaving like ordinary alluvial soil and starts to harden into something compacted, intentional, almost as if the ground itself had been pressed down by forces that no longer exist. Then the edge of stone appears. At first, it looks like nothing unusual, just another slab buried beneath centuries of collapse and sediment, but the surface is too regular, too controlled. The angles do not match natural fracture patterns, and when the dust is brushed away, faint markings begin to emerge, lines that do not belong to any known script in the region's catalogue of ancient languages. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What is uncovered next does not arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow accumulation of unease. More stones appear beneath the soil, aligned in a pattern that suggests architecture rather than geology. Then fragments of pottery, unusually thin, fired at temperatures higher than expected for the supposed time period of the surrounding sediment layers, and then something more unsettling, a broken seal, stamped with a symbol that matches nothing in the regional record, yet appears again and again in scattered fragments across multiple excavation sites hundreds of kilometres apart. Archaeology rarely deals in certainty, but it does deal in patterns, and this pattern begins to suggest something that should not exist. The excavation reports describe it cautiously at first: an unclassified cultural horizon, a previously unrecognised administrative layer. Now, these are careful phrases, designed to avoid drawing conclusions too quickly, but within academic circles, the language slowly shifts, not because certainty increases, but because the anomalies refuse to disappear. Across different sites, separated by geography and time, the same strange absence begins to emerge. Local civilizations have detailed records of wars, trade, droughts, and dynastic changes. They record neighbours, enemies, migrations, and even minor border disputes. Yet in all of them, there are gaps, sudden absences where something larger should have been, a power that should have left a footprint in stone, in ink, in memory. But instead, there is silence. And silence, in ancient history, is rarely natural. The first breakthrough does not come from a dramatic discovery, but from a broken archive recovered in a collapsed storage chamber beneath a forgotten settlement. The tablets inside are fragmented, some burned, others deliberately scratched out. What remains is incomplete, but enough survives to form a disturbing pattern. Names appear and vanish across successive copies of administrative lists. Entire regions are reassigned to different rulers without explanation, and in the margins, faint and nearly erased. A recurring designation appears, one that does not match any known kingdom, city-state, or empire of the era. It is not a name in the conventional sense, more like a placeholder that keeps changing shape depending on the context in which it is written. Scholars debate whether it refers to a people, a dynasty, or something close to an administrative system that transcended traditional state boundaries. But what matters more than what it is called is what is missing around it. The surrounding history behaves as if something has been removed. In the following years of excavation and comparative analysis, pattern grows sharper. Trade goods appear in one region that cannot be traced to any known production centre of the time. Metallurgical analysis reveals alloys consistent with advanced techniques, yet the supposed source cultures do not possess the technological continuity to explain them. Even burial sites show inconsistencies, artefacts that suggest contact between distant regions long before established trade networks would have made such contact possible. And yet, when historians attempt to trace this influence backward, they hit the same wall. No capital city, no founding myth, no surviving royal lineage, just fragments. What makes this even more difficult to interpret is the way neighbouring civilizations describe the missing presence when they do mention it at all. In some texts, it is described as a shadow administration, a structure that imposed order without visible rulers. In others, it is framed as a transient occupation, a force that arrives, reorganises trade routes, standardises measures, and then disappears without the usual markers of conquest or rebellion. But these accounts contradict each other so heavily that historians hesitate to treat them as direct evidence. Instead, they are seen as echoes, distorted memories of something too complex to preserve accurately. Still, the consistency of absence becomes its own kind of evidence. One of the most unsettling aspects of the discovery is not what is found, but what is deliberately not found. In regions where inscriptions were typically preserved on durable stone, entire sequences appear to have been chiselled away and replaced with neutral phrasing. In administrative sites where record-keeping was meticulous, there are sudden stylistic breaks, changes in script, terminology, and calendar systems that do not align with any known political transition. It is as if someone, or something, attempted to standardise history after the fact, not erase it completely, but reshape it. And this is where the debate begins to fracture. Some researchers argue that what is being observed is simply the result of fragmented preservation. Ancient records are incomplete by nature. Floods, fires, and the slow decay of organic materials create gaps that modern archaeology must constantly navigate. From this perspective, the so-called missing empire may never have been a unified entity at all, but rather a coincidence of overlapping regional cultures misinterpreted through modern reconstruction. Others, however, are less convinced. They point to the scale of the inconsistencies, the geographic spread of similar anomalies, the repeated appearance of identical symbolic motifs in unrelated regions, and most importantly, the absence of a coherent alternative explanation that can account for all observed data simultaneously. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Even climate data, which often provides a grounding framework for ancient collapse narratives, offers only partial alignment. There are periods of environmental stress-drought cycles, temperature fluctuations, shifting river systems, but nothing that clearly corresponds to a sudden global erasure of a single dominant cultural force. Instead, what emerges is something more ambiguous, a civilization that may have existed, but not in the way traditional historical models expect. Not necessarily centralized in a single capital, not necessarily recorded in a single language, possibly distributed, adaptive, and integrated into the very systems that later cultures inherited and redefined. And if that is the case, then its disappearance becomes even harder to explain, because you cannot easily erase something that has already been absorbed. As excavation expands across new regions, small but persistent clues continue to surface. A standardized system of weights found in unrelated sites, architectural techniques that appear suddenly and then vanish, and most intriguing of all, a shared pattern in administrative seals that suggests coordination across vast distances without obvious communication infrastructure. Each discovery adds weight to the idea that something once existed at scale, even if its identity remains elusive. But the further researchers push, the more resistance they encounter, not physical resistance, but interpretive limits. The evidence does not resolve into a clear narrative. It resists simplification. It fragments under scrutiny, as if it was never meant to be read as a single story in the first place. And so the central mystery deepens, not simply what this ancient superpower was, but why its presence in history feels both undeniable and intentionally obscured. Because the most striking feature of all is not its rise or fall, it is the quiet, systematic way it seems to have been removed from collective memory, not erased in a single act of destruction, but filtered out through generations of rewriting, copying, translating, and reorganizing historical records until only traces remain. And those traces are now beginning to surface again, in places where no one expected to find them. Buried not just in the earth, but in the structure of history itself, the plateau winds carry dust in slow, patient spirals, as if the land itself is still remembering what once stood here. Far beyond the initial excavation site, the same patterns begin to appear in places that were never meant to be connected. River valleys in one region, dry steppe corridors in another, coastal settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers of terrain that, in theory, should have limited any meaningful interaction. And yet, beneath each of these locations, archaeologists begin to find the same unsettling alignment, cultural layers that do not fit local historical sequences, and material evidence that feels imported from a shared, unseen system. The world before this discovery was already well mapped in academic terms. Known empires had been charted, their boundaries reconstructed through inscriptions, trade goods, and settlement layers. But history, as it is increasingly becoming clear, is never a complete map. It is a patchwork stitched together from what survives, and what survives is often shaped more by chance than by accuracy. What begins to emerge from these scattered anomalies is the suggestion of a larger structure beneath the known world, not a single empire in the traditional sense, but something more distributed, a networked civilization that does not present itself as a unified political body in the surviving records, yet behaves as if coordination once existed at a scale that would have required it. Before we go further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In the earliest reconstructions of ancient chronology, scholars assumed that large-scale coordination between distant regions was rare. Trade existed, of course, and ideas travelled, but they were slow, uneven, and heavily dependent on geography, mountains, deserts, and seas acted as natural barriers that limited interaction. That assumption still holds in many cases, but the evidence emerging from these new sites introduces a complication that does not fit comfortably within that framework. Standardized measurement systems appear across regions that, according to established timelines, should not yet have developed shared economic practices. Agricultural techniques, particularly irrigation patterns, show sudden similarities in design that cannot be easily explained by independent invention alone. Even burial customs, which are usually among the most culturally specific practices, display subtle but consistent overlaps in structure and orientation. These are not dramatic similarities that would immediately suggest a single unified empire. Instead, they are small, technical echoes, the kind of details that are often dismissed as coincidence until they appear too frequently to ignore. And it is in these details that the idea of a hidden ancient superpower begins to take shape. One of the most intriguing aspects of the evidence is its uneven distribution. Some regions show strong signs of influence advanced metallurgy, standardized administrative tools, architectural consistency, while neighbouring regions appear almost untouched. This patchiness does not align with what is typically expected from conquest or colonization, where influence radiates outward in a more predictable gradient. Instead, the pattern resembles something more selective, as if certain nodes in a vast system were activated while others remained dormant, or perhaps as if influence was not imposed from a central authority, but transmitted through channels that are no longer visible in the archaeological record. The challenge, of course, is that archaeology reconstructs systems from fragments. It rarely captures the full structure of a civilization, and when the structure is already fragmented in the surviving evidence, interpretation becomes even more fragile. In one excavation near an ancient river bend, researchers uncover what appears to be an administrative archive buried beneath a collapsed storage building. The materials are unusually well preserved due to a rapid sedimentation event, likely a flood that sealed the chamber quickly. Inside, they find thousands of small clay tags, each stamped with symbols that repeat across different regions. At first, these symbols are assumed to be local variants of known scripts, but as comparative analysis expands, that assumption weakens. The symbols do not evolve in a linear linguistic fashion. Instead, they remain strangely consistent across distance and time, suggesting either an extraordinary degree of centralized control or a shared bureaucratic system that transcended linguistic boundaries. This raises a difficult question. How does a civilization maintain administrative consistency across such vast and diverse regions without leaving behind a clearly identifiable cultural core? One possibility is technological. Some researchers propose that the system may have relied on standardized training centers or itinerant administrative officials who carried institutional knowledge across regions. Others suggest that trade guilds or religious institutions could have played a similar role, functioning as stabilizing frameworks that maintained continuity even as political structures shifted. But none of these explanations fully account for the scale and consistency of the evidence. Meanwhile, neighbouring civilizations begin to re-enter the discussion through re-examined texts. Old translations, once considered definitive, are being revised as new linguistic parallels emerge. In several cases, names of rulers and cities that were previously thought to be unrelated are now being linked through subtle textual markers, shared honorifics, repeated numerical systems, and synchronized calendar references that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Yet even these revised interpretations remain cautious. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. It points toward a level of organization that is difficult to reconcile with the fragmented political landscape typically assumed for the period. As more data accumulates, another pattern becomes visible. Wherever traces of this elusive civilization appear, there is often a corresponding absence of expected local development, not in a catastrophic sense, but in a developmental gap, a kind of historical discontinuity where cultural evolution seems to have been accelerated, redirected, or replaced entirely. This raises one of the most debated interpretations in the field, whether the presence of this ancient superpower did not simply coexist with other civilizations, but actively shaped their developmental trajectories in ways that later became indistinguishable from indigenous progress. If true, it would mean that parts of recorded history are not missing in the sense of being lost. They are missing because they were absorbed. But even this idea does not resolve the central mystery of disappearance, because absorption implies continuity, not erasure. Yet the record still shows a break, a point where references thin out, where symbols stop appearing, where administrative continuity fractures without a clear cause. Some researchers look to environmental factors again, shifts in river systems, prolonged drought cycles, volcanic activity that could have disrupted infrastructure and communication networks. These explanations account for local collapses, but struggle to explain the synchronized disappearance of a pattern that spans multiple ecological zones. Others propose more political explanations, internal fragmentation, civil conflict, or gradual decentralization that dissolved the system from within. But again, the archaeological signature does not clearly support a violent or abrupt collapse. There are no widespread destruction layers consistent with large-scale warfare across all affected regions. Instead, there is quiet disappearance, a fading rather than a fall, and in historical terms, that is far more difficult to reconstruct. Because history is usually written in moments of disruption wars, invasions, disasters, revolutions. But systems that dissolve gradually leave behind fewer dramatic markers. They leave gaps that are harder to interpret and easier to overlook. As excavation expands, researchers begin to notice something even more unsettling. In some regions, later civilizations appear to have built directly atop earlier administrative structures without acknowledging their existence. Foundations are reused, infrastructure is repurposed, even symbolic motifs are subtly integrated into new cultural frameworks without reference to their origin. It is as if the earlier system was not destroyed, but overwritten. And overwritten histories are the hardest to recover. The deeper the investigation goes, the more the evidence begins to suggest that what is being studied is not simply a lost civilization, but a disrupted continuity of civilization itself, a system that may have once operated across vast regions, leaving behind fragments that later cultures inherited without fully understanding their origin. Yet even this interpretation remains incomplete, because somewhere in the layers of silence, there are still missing pieces that do not fit any known model of development, collapse, or assimilation, and those missing pieces continue to resist explanation. Deep beneath the cracked river terraces, where sunlight never fully reaches the sediment layers, a different kind of history begins to surface. It is not written in grand monuments or dramatic destruction layers, but in the quieter language of repetition, identical clay seals, standardized weights, and administrative fragments that appear too consistent to belong to isolated cultures acting independently. The excavation teams notice it first in the smallest details. A seal impression found in a storage pit along a dry inland valley matches, almost perfectly, another discovered hundreds of kilometers away near an ancient coastal settlement, not just in symbol, but in spacing, proportion, and pressure pattern, the same hand, or at least the same system, seems to have produced both. This is where the idea of a hidden ancient superpower begins to shift from speculation into something more structurally unsettling, not because there is proof of a single centralized empire, but because there is growing evidence of coordination without clear origin. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In conventional historical models, coordination on this scale requires infrastructure, roads, communication systems, administrative hierarchies, and a stable governing centre. Even the largest ancient empires we know, of those that stretched across continents, left behind unmistakable signatures of central authority. Capitals emerge in the archaeological record. Royal inscriptions declare lineage and conquest. Borders shift but remain traceable through layers of settlement and fortification. Yet in this case, the expected anchors are missing. There is no clearly identifiable capital city that dominates the record. No singular administrative heart that aligns all evidence into a unified political structure. Instead, what appears is a distributed pattern like fragments of a larger system that no longer exists in complete form. And yet, the system itself seems to have existed. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from comparative analysis of measurement systems. Across multiple excavation sites, researchers identify units of weight and volume that are strikingly consistent, even when separated by vast distances and different cultural contexts. These are not loosely similar systems that evolved independently over time. They are precise enough to suggest shared origin or standardized calibration. This is unusual because measurement systems in the ancient world are typically among the most localized cultural features. They vary not only between civilizations, but often between cities within the same region. The emergence of a consistent framework across unrelated societies suggests either extraordinary cultural diffusion or a governing mechanism that enforced standardization. But if such a mechanism existed, it has left almost no direct trace of its structure. The puzzle deepens when examining infrastructure. In several regions, road networks appear suddenly, fully formed, without clear developmental stages. Irrigation systems show similar characteristics, complex hydraulic engineering that does not evolve gradually from simpler local systems, but appears already optimized in its earliest detected form. This pattern challenges the expectation of linear technological progression. Civilizations typically develop complexity incrementally. Early experimental forms give way to refined systems over generations. But here, the evidence suggests abrupt emergence followed by prolonged stability and then disappearance. What could explain this discontinuity remains unresolved. Some researchers propose that knowledge transfer may have occurred through non-traditional means. Rather than slow cultural evolution, information may have been transmitted through specialized institutions, itinerant engineers, or long-lived administrative guilds that preserve technical knowledge across generations and regions. This would allow for the appearance of sudden complexity, without requiring a centralized empire in the traditional sense. However, even this explanation struggles with scale. The consistency observed across distant regions implies not just shared knowledge, but shared enforcement of standards. Something more structured than informal exchange appears to be at work. And then there are the symbols. Across multiple excavation sites, recurring motifs appear on seals, pottery, and administrative tablets. They are not identical scripts, but they share structural similarities that suggest a common origin or influence. Some resemble abstract geometric frameworks, others combine pictographic elements with standardized numerical markers. What is most striking is not their content, but their distribution. These symbols appear in regions with no clear evidence of sustained direct contact. In one site, a fragment of clay tablet shows a partial inscription that matches, almost character for character, a sequence found in a distant valley settlement. Between them lies terrain that, in the reconstructed timeline, should have limited regular interaction. Such repetitions force archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about ancient connectivity. The traditional model of slow diffusion through trade routes may not fully account for the speed and uniformity of these shared elements. But even as the evidence accumulates, interpretation remains divided. One school of thought argues that what is being observed is the natural result of trade networks that were far more extensive than previously understood. In this view, the ancient world was more interconnected than the surviving records suggest, and what appears as an anomaly is simply the result of missing intermediary sites that have not yet been discovered. Another interpretation suggests something more centralized, a coordinating authority, that did not manifest as a visible empire in the traditional sense, but as a systemic framework embedded within multiple societies. Rather than conquering territories outright, it may have influenced governance indirectly through standardized practices, shared institutions, or economic dependencies. But there is also a more cautious perspective, which emphasizes the dangers of overinterpreting incomplete data. Archaeology, after all, is built on fragments. A pattern can appear significant simply because the missing pieces are still buried, eroded, or undiscovered. Still, even within this caution, the anomalies persist. One of the most perplexing aspects is the apparent absence of developmental friction. In most known civilizations, the adoption of new systems creates visible tension, old and new practices overlap, compete, and leave transitional artifacts behind. But in these sites, transitions appear unusually smooth, as if entire systems were replaced or implemented without visible conflict or gradual adaptation. This raises a difficult possibility. If there was an organizing force behind these patterns, it may have operated in ways fundamentally different from later empires. not through conquest alone, and not through simple cultural diffusion, but through systemic integration that left minimal transitional residue. And if that is the case, then the disappearance of this system becomes even more puzzling. Because systems that integrate deeply into multiple societies do not simply vanish without trace. They leave residual structures, lingering institutions, cultural echoes that remain identifiable even after political collapse. Yet here, even those echoes begin to fade beyond a certain point in time. Chronological analysis shows a gradual thinning of consistent markers. Standardized symbols become less frequent. Measurement systems diverge again. Administrative practices revert to localized forms. It is as if the underlying framework that once unified these regions gradually lost coherence until only isolated fragments remained. But there is no single moment of collapse, no definitive rupture. Instead, there is drift, and drift is harder to interpret than destruction. As researchers compile these findings, another layer of complexity emerges from environmental data. Climatic reconstructions suggest periods of instability, shifts in rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, and localized resource stress. These conditions could have disrupted long-distance coordination systems, especially if they relied on stable trade routes and predictable agricultural output. Yet again, the timing does not align perfectly. Environmental stress explains disruption, but not the specific pattern of selective disappearance observed across multiple regions. Some areas affected by environmental stress retain continuity. Others, under similar conditions, show abrupt breaks in cultural consistency. This uneven response suggests that environmental factors alone are insufficient to explain the broader pattern. What remains is a growing sense that the ancient world was shaped by influences that operated at a scale larger than any single known civilization, but in a form that does not match traditional definitions of empire, not centralized in the way later historical states would be, not absent either, but distributed in a way that challenges how history is usually reconstructed, and as more fragments are uncovered, the outline of that system becomes both clearer and more elusive at the same time. Clearer in its repetition, more elusive in its origin, because every new discovery adds structure to the pattern, but not clarity to its source. And somewhere beneath all of it, the question continues to persist without resolution. What kind of power leaves behind coordination without identity, influence without center, and structure without memory? The wind over the excavation fields changes direction just as the next layer of history begins to surface. It is subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but the archaeologists working across multiple sites begin to describe the same sensation that the ground is no longer simply revealing the past, but resisting its interpretation. In one valley site, a collapsed administrative structure yields what appears to be a storage chamber sealed deliberately rather than destroyed. Inside, clay tablets are stacked in organized rows, not scattered by catastrophe. This is important. Destruction leaves disorder, intent leaves structure, and here, structure survives in a way that suggests continuity of administration up to the moment of abandonment, yet the records themselves are incomplete. Large sections are missing, as if removed intentionally, not broken, not decayed, but extracted. The edges of the remaining fragments show clean separation points, suggesting that portions of the archive were taken elsewhere before the structure was sealed. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This single detail changes the direction of interpretation. Until now, the absence of a clear capital or centralized archive had been one of the strongest arguments against the existence of a unified superpower. But the possibility that records were deliberately relocated introduces a different model entirely, one in which historical preservation was not passive, but actively controlled. Across other excavation sites, similar patterns emerge. Storage rooms appear intentionally emptied. Administrative buildings show signs of systematic clearing rather than abrupt abandonment. Even settlements that show no evidence of warfare or environmental collapse seem to have undergone a quiet dismantling of their bureaucratic structures before being left to decay. This is not the signature of collapse in the traditional sense. It resembles withdrawal, and withdrawal implies agency. The implications of this shift are profound. If a large-scale ancient system existed, and if it deliberately removed or relocated its administrative records, then the absence of evidence in the archaeological record may not be accidental. It may be the result of intentional historical restructuring. This possibility forces a reconsideration of earlier assumptions. The idea that history is simply what survives becomes less stable. Instead, history becomes something that has been curated, shaped not only by time and decay, but by decisions made by the very civilizations it seeks to describe. In several sites, researchers begin to identify a recurring architectural pattern associated with what are believed to be administrative hubs. These structures are not monumental in the conventional sense. They are not palaces or temples designed for display. Instead, they are functional complexes, often partially underground, designed for storage, documentation, and coordination. What is unusual is their distribution. They appear in clusters across regions that are otherwise culturally distinct, not in a centralized imperial core, but in a network that spans ecological and linguistic boundaries. Each cluster contains similar structural layouts, suggesting standardized design principles. This raises a difficult question: how does architectural standardization spread without visible political unification? One explanation is technological convergence. Independent societies, facing similar administrative challenges, may have developed similar solutions, but the precision of the similarities makes this less likely. the probability of identical structural layouts emerging independently across distant regions is low, particularly when considering the specific functional details observed in the remains. Another explanation involves institutional transfer. Skilled architects, engineers, and administrators may have travelled widely, carrying standardised knowledge with them. This would require a level of mobility and communication infrastructure that is not fully supported by current archaeological evidence, but it remains a plausible mechanism. Still, neither explanation fully resolves the pattern of synchrony observed in the archaeological layers. In some regions, architectural transitions appear to occur almost simultaneously. Older systems are replaced by standardised designs within a relatively narrow chronological window. This kind of coordinated transformation suggests either a powerful unifying influence or a shared cultural framework that is no longer visible in the surviving record, and yet, no single political entity has been identified that could account for this scale of coordination. As researchers continue to analyse these structures, attention shifts toward the material culture associated with them. Objects found within these administrative complexes show a striking consistency in design and function. Writing tools, sealing devices, and measurement instruments appear to follow shared standards, even when located far apart. One of the most intriguing discoveries is a set of identical sealing devices found in 3 separate excavation sites. Each device bears the same abstract emblem, worn slightly differently due to usage, but manufactured with the same technical precision. Metallurgical analysis suggests they were produced using comparable alloy compositions and casting techniques. This level of standardization implies more than cultural influence. It suggests institutional regulation of production methods across vast distances. Yet, paradoxically, there is no evidence of a central manufacturing hub or industrial centre capable of producing and distributing these tools at scale. The system appears to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This paradox leads to a growing debate within the archaeological community. Some scholars propose that what is being observed is not a single empire, but a distributed administrative civilization, one that operated through interconnected nodes rather than centralized authority. In this model, each region maintained local autonomy while adhering to shared systemic standards. Others argue that this interpretation risks projecting modern organizational concepts onto ancient societies. They caution that similarities do not necessarily imply coordination, and that convergent evolution in administrative practices remains a viable explanation. But even within this caution, the persistence of anomalies continues to challenge simple interpretations. In one particularly significant excavation, a buried corridor system is discovered beneath what was once a mid-sized settlement. The corridors extend far beyond the settlement's known boundaries, suggesting a subterranean network that connected multiple administrative zones. The design is consistent, with standardized dimensions and recurring structural markers. What is most striking is the absence of defensive features. There are no fortifications, no signs of military reinforcement, no evidence that these systems were built in response to external threat. Instead, they appear designed purely for movement, storage, and coordination. This suggests a level of stability in the broader system that is difficult to reconcile with the known volatility of ancient geopolitical landscapes. And yet, stability alone does not explain disappearance. As analysis continues, researchers begin to notice a temporal pattern. The standardized systems appear abruptly in the archaeological record, remain stable for a significant period, and then gradually disappear without clear replacement. Localized systems re-emerge afterward, often incorporating fragments of the earlier standardized framework but without maintaining its coherence. This sequence suggests not just transformation, but dissolution. But again, not dissolution marked by catastrophe. Instead, something slower, a fading of connectivity, a breakdown in synchronization. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of systemic overload. Large-scale coordination networks may have become unsustainable under changing environmental or economic conditions. Others suggest political fragmentation, where decentralized regions gradually abandoned shared systems in favor of local adaptation. However, neither explanation fully accounts for the absence of transitional conflict markers. There is no widespread evidence of war or rebellion corresponding to the systemic breakdown. No clear destruction layers indicating violent collapse across all affected regions. Instead, what remains is discontinuity without destruction. And discontinuity is one of the hardest phenomena to reconstruct in historical analysis, because it leaves behind structure without closure. As the investigation deepens, a more unsettling possibility begins to surface. Some scholars suggest that the system did not collapse in the traditional sense at all. Instead, it may have been deliberately dismantled or restructured by its own participants. If true, this would imply a level of coordination and dissolution equal to the coordination and construction, a controlled retreat rather than a chaotic fall. But even this hypothesis struggles to explain the near-total absence of a unifying narrative in surviving records. No texts explicitly describe such a transition. No inscriptions clearly document a planned withdrawal or restructuring at a civilizational scale. What remains are only indirect traces, silences, gaps, and reconfigurations in the material record, and so the mystery deepens further. Because what is being uncovered is not just the outline of a forgotten system, but the possibility that its disappearance was itself structured, gradual, and possibly intentional, leaving behind a world that remembers fragments of it, but cannot reconstruct its centre. Beneath the hardened floodplain where ancient rivers once changed course without warning, the soil reveals something that does not belong to the ordinary rhythm of settlement and abandonment. It is not a ruin in the traditional sense. It is a layered accumulation of administrative debris seals, broken tablets, and standardized tokens compressed into a sequence that suggests continuity rather than collapse. But continuity is deceptive here, because as the layers are carefully separated, a pattern emerges that is far more unsettling than simple disappearance. The standardized systems do not end abruptly. They thin out, gradually, predictably, as if something once widespread begins to lose coherence across distance, not through destruction, but through fragmentation of coordination itself. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, this thinning effect appears across multiple excavation zones. In earlier strata, administrative artifacts are abundant and consistent. In later layers, they become irregular, localized, and increasingly distorted. Symbols that once followed strict geometric rules begin to shift subtly in form. Measurement tokens lose uniform calibration. Seal impressions vary in pressure and design. The system, whatever it was, begins to drift, and drift is not collapse. It is something more ambiguous. One of the most important discoveries in this phase comes from a site near an ancient irrigation basin. Here, archaeologists uncover a sequence of stratified settlement layers that preserve what appears to be a long-term administrative transition. At the lowest levels, there is strong evidence of standardized governance. At the upper levels, those standards gradually disappear, replaced by localized adaptations that vary from household to household. What makes this sequence remarkable is the absence of destruction layers between phases. There is no evidence of invasion, fire, or sudden abandonment. Instead, the transition is smooth, almost bureaucratic in nature, as if systems were slowly decommissioned rather than forcibly removed. This introduces a critical shift in interpretation. Until now, the disappearance of this ancient superpower had been framed in terms of collapse or erasure, but the archaeological record increasingly suggests something more controlled. Not an event, but a process that unfolded unevenly across geography and time. In some regions, standardized systems persist longer. In others, they vanish earlier. This uneven dissolution suggests that whatever held the system together was not uniformly enforced across all territories. Instead, it may have depended on regional stability, resource flow, or institutional adherence that varied across nodes of the network. The idea of a centralized empire becomes harder to maintain under these conditions. Instead, the evidence increasingly supports a model of distributed governance, one that relied on synchronized standards rather than direct control. But synchronization requires maintenance, and maintenance requires continuity. When that continuity breaks, even slightly, the entire system begins to fragment. One of the most striking aspects of this fragmentation is its asymmetry. Some administrative practices disappear entirely, while others persist in altered form. For example, certain measurement systems survive in simplified versions long after standardized calibration is lost. Similarly, some architectural forms continue to be used, but without their original structural precision. This selective survival suggests that not all components of the system were equally dependent on central coordination. Some elements were resilient enough to adapt locally, others were tightly bound to systemic regulation and collapsed quickly once that regulation weakened. This pattern is difficult to reconcile with traditional models of imperial collapse, which typically involve more abrupt and geographically concentrated failure. Instead, what is observed here resembles a network gradually losing synchronization across its nodes. As research expands, attention turns to the human dimension of this transition. Settlement patterns show subtle but important changes over time. Populations do not disappear suddenly. They redistribute. Smaller communities begin to form where larger administrative centers once existed. Trade becomes more localized. Material culture becomes more diverse, less standardized, and more regionally distinct. This is not the disappearance of people. It is the disappearance of coordination between them. In one particularly revealing excavation, a series of domestic structures shows evidence of households transitioning from standardized administrative integration to independent local systems within a single generation. Older layers contain uniform tokens and seal impressions associated with broader administrative networks. Upper layers show individualized variants, often crudely adapted from earlier standardized forms. This suggests that knowledge of the system persisted even after the system itself weakened. People remembered how it worked, but no longer had access to its full structure, and memory alone is not enough to sustain coordination at scale. At another site, researchers uncover what appears to be a regional archive that had been repurposed multiple times. Original administrative records are overwritten with local records, then partially erased again. The physical layers of documentation suggest repeated attempts to reorganize information systems in the absence of a stable governing framework. Each attempt becomes less standardized than the last. Each revision moves further away from the original system. This iterative breakdown raises an important question: was the system actively dismantled, or did it simply lose the capacity to maintain itself? Some researchers propose that environmental pressures played a key role. Long-term climatic instability could have disrupted agricultural surplus, which in turn would have weakened administrative cohesion. Reduced resource flow would naturally lead to decentralization as regions became more self-sufficient out of necessity. There is some support for this hypothesis in paleoclimate data, which shows periods of variability in rainfall and temperature across multiple affected regions. However, these fluctuations do not align perfectly with the timing of systemic fragmentation observed in the archaeological record. Other scholars suggest economic complexity as a factor. Large-scale systems often become vulnerable to inefficiencies as they expand. Coordination costs increase, communication delays accumulate, and local adaptations diverge from central standards. Over time, such systems may naturally degrade without requiring a single catastrophic trigger. This model aligns more closely with the gradual thinning of standardized practices observed in the data, yet it still leaves unanswered questions about the initial emergence and remarkable coherence of the system before its decline. Because systems that emerge with such precision do not typically arise spontaneously at this scale, and yet here, it appears to have done exactly that. Another line of interpretation considers institutional fragility. If the system relied heavily on specialized administrative groups or knowledge-keeping institutions, then disruptions to those groups through migration, demographic change, or internal reorganization could have cascading effects on the entire structure. This would explain the unevenness of the collapse. Some regions maintain continuity longer because they retain institutional knowledge. Others fragment quickly once key personnel or communication channels are lost. But even this explanation struggles with the near-total absence of explicit historical records describing such a breakdown. No clear accounts of administrative failure survive in a form that matches the scale of the archaeological evidence. Instead, later civilizations reference earlier systems only indirectly, often with vague or symbolic language that suggests partial understanding rather than direct inheritance. It is as if the knowledge of the system itself was gradually lost alongside its structure. As excavation continues, researchers begin to notice something even more subtle. In the latest layers of affected regions, remnants of standardized systems are sometimes repurposed in entirely new cultural contexts. Seals become decorative motifs, measurement tools are adapted for local use, architectural elements are incorporated into different structural traditions. This suggests not rejection, but absorption. The system does not vanish completely. It dissolves into the cultures that follow, and dissolution leaves traces that are harder to identify than destruction. Because destruction ends something, dissolution transforms it, and what has been transformed cannot easily be traced back to its origin. This is where the mystery reaches a deeper level. Not just how an ancient superpower could disappear, but how its disappearance could become invisible within the very cultures that inherited its remnants, leaving behind a world that carries fragments of its structure without recognizing the system that once connected them. The buried corridor does not appear like a ruin at first. It appears like intention that has been paused. Stone walls running clean, measured lines beneath the layers of sediment that should have collapsed into chaos over time. Yet the geometry remains unusually intact, as if the structure was designed not only to survive abandonment, but to remain legible long after its builders were gone. The excavation team follows it slowly, brushing away centuries of compressed soil, and the passage seems to extend further than any single settlement should reasonably support. What begins as a local discovery quickly becomes something larger, because similar corridors are already known from other regions, and they should not connect. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In the early interpretation, these underground passages were thought to be isolated infrastructure projects, storage routes, drainage systems, or perhaps ceremonial pathways. But as mapping expands, a different picture emerges. The corridors align across distant sites with unsettling consistency. Not perfectly continuous in a literal sense, but structurally coherent, as if they were segments of a larger system designed with shared principles. The question is no longer whether these structures exist. It is what kind of civilization builds networks that span regions without leaving a clear political or cultural centre in the archaeological record. The corridors themselves are simple in construction, but sophisticated in planning. They maintain consistent width ratios, standardized turning angles, and recurring architectural markers placed at regular intervals. In some sections, ventilation shafts are positioned in patterns that suggest advanced understanding of airflow management. In others, recessed niches appear at intervals that imply organized storage or transfer points. Nothing about this is ornamental. Everything is functional. And function implies coordination. One of the most striking discoveries within the corridor network is the presence of identical structural inscriptions carved into the stone at key junction points. These inscriptions are not narrative texts. They are not decorative symbols. They appear to function more like operational markers, guides for navigation, classification, or system identification. The same sequence appears in multiple locations separated by vast distances. This raises a fundamental problem in interpretation. If these corridors were built independently by different cultures, the repetition of identical structural codes becomes difficult to explain. But if they were part of a unified system, then the absence of a central administrative hub becomes even more difficult to reconcile. Either the system was far more advanced in coordination than previously assumed, or it was not centralized in the way ancient empires typically are. As exploration continues, the corridors reveal another layer of complexity. Some sections show signs of modification over time. Doorways are sealed in later phases. New passages are cut through older walls. Certain junctions are reinforced while others are abandoned entirely. This suggests long-term use and adaptation rather than a single construction event. But the modifications are not random. They follow patterns that repeat across different regions. This is where the idea of a distributed system begins to take stronger shape. Instead of a single capital directing expansion, the evidence suggests multiple interconnected nodes that maintain shared standards. These nodes appear to have operated semi-independently while adhering to a broader structural framework. such a system would not behave like an empire in the traditional sense. It would behave like a network, and networks are fragile in different ways. Unlike empires, which often collapse through conquest or internal rebellion, networks fail through disconnection. When communication breaks down, when coordination weakens, when shared standards are no longer maintained, the system does not fall, it fragments. This fragmentation is visible in the corridor network itself. In earlier layers, connections between regions appear coherent and consistent. In later layers, alignment becomes irregular. Some passages terminate abruptly, others diverge into local systems that no longer follow standardized design principles. The once unified structure begins to dissolve into regional variations, yet there is no clear evidence of destruction, no widespread burning, no uniform collapse layer, only gradual disintegration of connectivity. One particularly revealing excavation occurs near a junction site that appears to have functioned as a major transfer node. Here, archaeologists uncover evidence of repeated structural reconfiguration. Entire sections of the corridor have been rerouted multiple times, suggesting changing administrative priorities or shifting network demands. But what is missing is just as important as what is present. There are no records explaining why these changes occurred. No inscriptions detailing system-wide reforms, no narrative explanation of transition, just structural evidence of adjustment without documentation. This absence becomes increasingly significant as more sites are compared. In regions where written records survive from later cultures, references to earlier systems are fragmented and indirect. They speak of former routes, old standards, or earlier measures, but rarely describe the system in operational detail. Even when they do, the terminology is inconsistent, suggesting that later societies inherited partial understanding rather than complete knowledge. This creates a disconnect between material evidence and historical memory. The physical system is extensive, the remembered system is vague, and the two do not align neatly. As researchers attempt to reconstruct the function of the corridor network, multiple hypotheses emerge. Some suggest it was primarily economic, a trade infrastructure designed to facilitate movement of goods across large distances. Others propose administrative or logistical functions, possibly related to taxation, resource distribution, or population management. A smaller group of researchers considers a more integrated interpretation that the network served multiple functions simultaneously, combining trade, administration, and communication into a single infrastructural system. This would explain its scale and standardization, but it would also require a level of systemic coordination that is difficult to explain without a central organizing authority, and yet no such authority appears in the record. Another complication arises when examining the material used in construction. While stone sources vary regionally, the techniques used in shaping and assembling the corridors show remarkable consistency. Tool marks, cutting angles, and finishing methods suggest shared training or standardized instruction across distant regions. This implies the existence of knowledge transmission mechanisms that are not fully visible in the archaeological record, possibly travelling specialists, possibly institutional training centres, possibly something more structured that has not yet been identified. As analysis deepens, attention turns to the possibility that the corridor network was not merely infrastructure, but also a form of spatial organisation that encoded administrative logic directly into the landscape. In this interpretation, geography itself becomes part of the system, with physical space functioning as a medium for coordination. If true, this would explain why the system leaves so few textual records. The structure itself would carry information functionally, reducing reliance on written documentation. But such systems are also vulnerable, because when coordination breaks, the physical network remains, but its meaning becomes opaque, and that is what appears to have happened here. The corridors persist, but their purpose fades. In some regions, later settlements build over these structures without recognizing their original function. In others, entrances are sealed deliberately, suggesting either abandonment or avoidance. Local traditions occasionally reference old paths or silent ways, but these accounts are inconsistent and often symbolic rather than descriptive. Over time, the system becomes invisible not because it is gone, but because its logic is no longer understood. And when a system loses interpretability, it effectively ceases to exist in functional memory. This is perhaps the most important transformation revealed by the corridor network. Not collapse, not destruction, but obsolescence of meaning. And once meaning is lost, even the most extensive systems can become indistinguishable from natural landscape. Yet beneath that silence, the structure still remains, waiting not to be rebuilt, but to be understood again. The seal impression is small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, yet its implications are large enough to destabilize entire historical models. It is found in a shallow storage pit beneath what was once a modest settlement on the edge of an ancient agricultural basin. At first, it appears unremarkable, a fragment of fired clay, worn by time, stamped with an abstract emblem. But when compared against previously catalogued symbols from distant excavation sites, it matches not just in design, but in microscopic production detail. The same irregularities in pressure, the same microcracks in the clay matrix, the same subtle distortion at the edge where the seal was pressed and lifted. It is not simply the same symbol, it is the same instrument, and it should not be here. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In archaeology, repetition is never just repetition, it is evidence of connection. But connection at this scale implies a level of coordination that challenges how ancient societies are typically understood. Because this seal does not belong to a single site, or even a single region, identical impressions of it have been recovered across a wide geographical spread, each embedded in different cultural layers, each associated with different local traditions. Yet all of them converge on the same source of manufacture, or at least the same standardized process. This introduces a critical tension in interpretation. Either a highly centralized production system existed, capable of distributing identical administrative tools across vast distances, or multiple independent regions were operating under a shared technological and symbolic framework that has left no surviving record of its origin. Neither explanation fits comfortably within established historical narratives. As more seals are analysed, a pattern emerges that is even more unsettling. The distribution is not uniform. Certain regions contain dense concentrations of these standardized artifacts, while others, located between them, show almost none. This creates a fragmented map of influence that does not align with known trade routes, political boundaries, or environmental constraints. It resembles something more selective, as if the system was active in specific zones while deliberately absent in others. This uneven distribution raises the possibility that what is being observed is not a single empire expanding outward, but a structured network operating through nodes of influence. In such a model, certain regions function as administrative or logistical hubs, while others remain peripheral or independent, yet still connected through invisible systemic relationships. But this model also introduces a new problem in visibility of hierarchy. In known ancient systems, hierarchy leaves traces. Capitals accumulate wealth, inscriptions, and architectural prominence. Administrative centres grow larger, more complex, and more visible over time. Yet in this case, no such gradient is clearly detectable. The sites associated with standardized seals do not consistently show greater wealth, larger population density, or more monumental architecture than surrounding areas. Instead, influence appears distributed in a way that does not match physical dominance, which suggests that power, in this context, may not have been expressed through territorial control in the conventional sense. As investigations expand, attention turns to production sites. If standardized seals exist across vast regions, then somewhere there must have been centres of manufacture. Yet despite extensive surveying, no singular production hub has been identified. Instead, evidence points to multiple small-scale workshops producing identical objects using remarkably consistent techniques. This raises a difficult question. How is manufacturing standardization maintained without centralized oversight? One possibility is shared training traditions. Craftsmen could have been educated within a unified institutional framework before dispersing across regions. Another possibility is the existence of travelling production units, mobile specialists who maintained consistency across distance. But both explanations struggle to account for the precision of replication observed in the artifacts. Even microscopic tool marks align too closely across distant sites to be easily explained by informal transmission. And so, the question shifts again. Was there a hidden administrative system coordinating production without leaving clear evidence of its structure? Or is modern analysis imposing artificial unity onto naturally similar but independent developments? The debate remains unresolved. Meanwhile, a new line of evidence begins to complicate the picture further. In several excavation sites, seals are found not only in administrative context, but also in domestic and ritual environments. This suggests that their function extended beyond bureaucracy. They may have carried symbolic, economic, or even social significance that transcended purely administrative use. In some cases, seals appear deliberately broken and deposited in structured arrangements, implying ritualized decommissioning. In others, they are reused in modified forms, incorporated into local traditions long after standardized systems appear to have faded. This duality is important, because it indicates that the system was not simply abandoned, it was transformed, and transformation often leaves deeper cultural traces than destruction. As researchers map the temporal distribution of these artifacts, another pattern becomes visible. The appearance of standardized seals correlates with periods of increased regional connectivity, expanded trade, shared architectural forms, and synchronized administrative practices. Their decline, however, does not coincide with a single catastrophic event, but with a gradual return to localized systems. This gradualism is critical. It suggests that whatever unified the system was not violently removed, but slowly lost. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of institutional fatigue. Large-scale coordination systems require constant reinforcement. If communication channels weaken, or if the costs of maintaining standardization exceed the benefits, local regions may gradually revert to autonomous practices. Others suggest demographic shifts, population movement, migration, or urban decline could disrupt the institutional continuity necessary for maintaining standardized systems. But neither explanation fully accounts for the geographic irregularity of the transition. Some regions retain standardized artifacts long after others have abandoned them. This asynchronous decay suggests that the system did not fail uniformly, but fractured along lines that are not yet fully understood. One of the most intriguing discoveries in this phase comes from a layered deposit containing sequential seal impressions spanning multiple generations. Early layers show strict adherence to standardized forms, middle layers show minor deviations, upper layers show significant variation, including hybrid designs that combine standardized elements with local artistic motifs. This sequence provides a rare glimpse into transition, not collapse, but adaptation under changing conditions. An adaptation implies agency. People were not simply passive recipients of systemic breakdown, they were actively modifying, reinterpreting, and integrating elements of the older system into new cultural frameworks. This raises an important possibility that the disappearance of the ancient superpower was not absolute. It may have persisted in altered forms, embedded within successor cultures in ways that are no longer recognizable as part of a single unified origin. If true, then the system did not vanish, it dispersed, and dispersion is far more difficult to trace than extinction, because dispersed systems leave behind fragments that appear unrelated until placed back into their original context, which may no longer be recoverable. As this idea gains traction, researchers begin to re-examine older excavation data. Previously dismissed anomalies, isolated symbols, inconsistent measurement units, unusual architectural alignments are now being reconsidered as potential residual elements of the same underlying system. Patterns begin to reappear where none were previously recognized, but recognition does not equal reconstruction. The structure remains incomplete, and the center remains missing. Because even if fragments persist, the organizing principle that once connected them is no longer visible in the historical record, and without that principle, the system remains forever partial, a civilization that can be detected in pieces but never fully assembled, a superpower that exists clearly in its traces but not in its name. The break in the record does not announce itself, it simply arrives, quietly, like a missing heartbeat in a long sequence that once felt steady. Across multiple excavation zones, the same pattern begins to appear at roughly similar chronological thresholds. Standardized seals become rare, administrative tablets thin out, corridor usage declines, architectural consistency weakens. But there is no single destruction layer that could explain this shift across all regions, no universal catastrophe horizon, no uniform collapse signature. Instead, there is something more unsettling, a synchronization failure. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In earlier interpretations, scholars assumed that the disappearance of a large-scale system would leave behind clear evidence of rupture, wars, fires, mass abandonment layers, or abrupt cultural discontinuities. Ancient history is often reconstructed through these dramatic signatures because they are easy to identify in the soil. But what is being uncovered here does not behave like a collapse in the conventional sense. It behaves like a decoupling. Systems that were once aligned begin to drift out of phase with one another. Measurement standards diverge. Administrative terminology changes independently across regions. Trade artifacts lose uniformity. Even architectural styles, once remarkably consistent, begin to evolve in localized directions, and yet, life continues. Settlements remain occupied, agriculture persists, local governance adapts. There is no evidence of total societal breakdown. Instead, what fades is the coherence that once linked these regions into a unified system. This distinction is critical because it suggests that the ancient superpower, whatever its true nature, may not have been a singular political entity in the way later empires were. Instead, it may have functioned as a coordinating framework layered over existing societies. A system of systems, and when such a framework weakens, it does not necessarily destroy the societies beneath it. It simply stops synchronizing them. One of the most important pieces of evidence supporting this interpretation comes from comparative stratigraphy across multiple sites. In earlier layers, administrative artifacts are highly standardized. In middle layers, variation increases but remains recognizable. In later layers, local systems dominate completely, with only faint echoes of earlier uniformity. This progression is not abrupt, it is gradual, but consistent. And consistency across geography suggests a shared underlying process rather than isolated regional developments. At one inland site, archaeologists uncover a sequence of storage structures that clearly demonstrate this transition. The earlier structures are part of a standardized design network, matching layouts found hundreds of kilometers away. Later structures deviate slightly, adapting to local needs. The final phase abandons standardized layouts entirely, favoring irregular, locally optimized designs. What is absent from this sequence is equally important. There is no evidence of destruction between phases, no burning layer, no invasion debris, no forced reconstruction, just evolution away from standardization. This raises a difficult question. If the system was not destroyed, why was it abandoned? One possibility is institutional failure at the coordination level. Large-scale systems depend on the maintenance of shared standards, and those standards require continuous reinforcement. If communication networks weaken, even slightly, divergence begins. Over time, divergence compounds, eventually breaking the coherence of the entire structure. Another possibility involves economic strain. Maintaining standardized systems across vast distances may have required resources that became unsustainable under changing environmental or demographic conditions. As local regions prioritize survival over coordination, centralized frameworks may have been gradually ignored. Climate data provides partial support for this idea. Periods of environmental variability are evident across several regions associated with the system's decline. Shifts in rainfall patterns, temperature instability, and resource unpredictability could have placed significant pressure on long-distance coordination. But again, the timing is imperfect. Environmental stress does not align neatly with the pattern of systemic fragmentation. Some regions maintain coherence through periods of instability. Others fragment during relatively stable climatic phases. This inconsistency suggests that environmental factors alone cannot fully explain the breakdown. As researchers continue to analyse the data, another layer of complexity emerges. In several regions, there is evidence of what appears to be intentional simplification of administrative systems. Complex standardised forms are replaced by simpler local variants. Multi-layered accounting systems are reduced to basic record-keeping. Specialised symbols are replaced with more general motifs. This is not random decay. It appears to be deliberate adaptation, and adaptation implies decision-making. One interpretation is that local authorities may have actively chosen to abandon complex centralised systems in favour of more manageable local governance structures. If the cost of maintaining synchronisation exceeded its benefits, decentralisation would not only be inevitable but rational. However, this interpretation raises a deeper question. If decentralisation was voluntary and widespread, why is there so little textual evidence describing such a transformation? In known historical cases of systemic change, societies typically leave behind narratives explaining transition justifications, reforms, ideological shifts. But in this case, such narratives are scarce or ambiguous. Instead, what survives are indirect references, vague mentions of former measures, earlier orders, or old ways. These phrases suggest memory without clarity, recognition without understanding. It is as if the system was no longer fully comprehensible, even to those who inherited its remnants. At another site, researchers discover a rare transitional archive containing overlapping administrative layers from different periods. Early entries follow strict standardized formats. Later entries become increasingly localized. Eventually, the format breaks down entirely, replaced by fragmented notes that appear to serve immediate practical needs rather than systematic record-keeping. This sequence provides a rare glimpse into administrative entropy, a gradual loss of structure within record systems that once relied on precision and consistency. Yet even here, there is no sign of sudden collapse, only gradual simplification. As more data accumulates, a troubling possibility begins to emerge. The ancient superpower may not have ended at a single point in time. Instead, it may have dissolved asynchronously across regions, with each node of the system detaching at different moments depending on local conditions. This would explain the uneven archaeological signatures. It would also explain the absence of a unified historical account of its end, because there may have been no single end at all, only multiple disconnected dissolutions. But this interpretation still leaves a central mystery unresolved. If the system dissolved gradually and unevenly, why does it appear so coherent in its peak phase? How did such a fragile structure achieve such widespread synchronization in the first place? One hypothesis suggests that the system may have relied on periodic reinforcement cycles, moments when standards were re-established across regions through coordinated administrative updates. If these cycles ceased, the system would naturally begin to drift apart. Another hypothesis suggests that the system's coherence may have depended on a cultural or ideological foundation that weakened over time. Shared beliefs, practices, or institutional loyalties could have provided the cohesion necessary for synchronization, and their erosion would lead to fragmentation. But both explanations remain speculative. What is clear is that coherence existed, and then it did not. And between those two states lies the entire unresolved history of this ancient superpower. A history defined not by sudden collapse, but by the slow unravelling of connection. Leaving behind fragments that no longer know they were once part of a larger whole, the silence in the record is no longer interpreted as absence. It is beginning to look like structure. At several key excavation zones, the same phenomenon repeats with unsettling consistency. Layers that should contain transitional evidence between one cultural phase and another instead show clean breaks in documentation, not destruction layers, not abandonment debris, but missing sequences where continuity would normally be expected. It is as if the archive of an entire administrative world has been selectively edited, and what remains is only what could not be removed. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This idea of selective removal was once considered too speculative for serious archaeological discussion. Ancient civilizations, even highly organised ones, were assumed to leave behind traces that decay, scatter, or become buried over time. But deliberate, large-scale historical removal implies a level of coordination that is difficult to demonstrate in material evidence. Yet the pattern refuses to disappear. In multiple regions, administrative strata show identical gaps. Entire sequences of standardized records vanish simultaneously across geographically distant sites, not gradually eroded, not partially preserved, but absent in a way that suggests intervention. This is where the debate shifts, because collapse explains fragmentation, but it does not easily explain uniform absence. Some researchers begin to reconsider earlier interpretations of the corridor networks and seal systems. If those structures represented not just administrative tools, but a unified informational framework, then the disappearance of records may not reflect loss alone. It may reflect controlled discontinuation of a system that once spanned multiple regions. A difficult possibility begins to form, that what is being studied is not simply a civilization that faded, but a civilization that was partially withdrawn from the historical record while still leaving behind its physical infrastructure. In one inland basin site, archaeologists uncover a layered settlement where the administrative transition is unusually abrupt. Lower layers show strict standardization across artifacts, seals, and architectural planning. Upper layers show immediate abandonment of those standards, replaced by localized improvisation. Between them, there is no evidence of gradual change, just a clean structural pivot, and this pivot appears in multiple unrelated regions. Such synchronization suggests either an external catalyst or an internal directive that operated across wide distances. If environmental collapse were responsible, one would expect uneven disruption patterns tied to ecological stress zones. Instead, the breaks occur in regions with differing environmental conditions but similar administrative alignment. This inconsistency challenges simple environmental explanations. At the same time, there is no clear evidence of widespread military destruction that could account for the simultaneous disappearance of standardized systems. No uniform burn layers, no consistent weapon debris horizons, no mass graves aligned with coordinated conflict events across all affected areas. This absence of violence is as significant as the absence of continuity. It suggests that whatever happened, it was not a conventional conquest or invasion. Another line of interpretation focuses on institutional withdrawal. If the system depended on specialized administrative networks, scribes, engineers, coordinators, and standard keepers, then the withdrawal or dissolution of those groups could produce rapid systemic fragmentation. But even this explanation struggles with scale, because the standardization appears too widespread, too consistent, and too deeply embedded in material culture to have been maintained by isolated groups alone. In several regions, researchers identify what appear to be last-phase artifacts, objects produced during the final period of systemic coherence. These items show increasing irregularity in execution, but still retain traces of earlier standardized forms. It is as if the system was still remembered, even as it was no longer fully operational. This memory persistence is crucial. It suggests that the system did not vanish abruptly from human awareness. Instead, it gradually lost functional relevance while remaining partially visible in cultural memory. And then something even more intriguing appears in the record. In a small number of sites, later cultural layers contain deliberate references to earlier standardized systems, but in abstract or symbolic form, not as direct continuation, but as reinterpretation. Seals become decorative motifs. Administrative symbols become ritual patterns. Architectural layouts become symbolic alignments in new structures. This is not preservation, it is transformation of meaning. And transformation is one of the key mechanisms by which historical systems become invisible over time. Because once a functional system becomes symbolic, it is no longer recognized as infrastructure. It becomes culture, art, tradition, memory without operational understanding. At another excavation site, a rare bilingual inscription is discovered. One side uses a late local script, while the other contains fragmented standardized symbols associated with the earlier system. The translation is incomplete, but the structure suggests reference rather than explanation. It does not describe the system. It gestures toward it, as if assuming prior understanding that no longer exists. This raises a profound interpretive problem. How do you reconstruct a system that was once widely known, but later became culturally unintelligible even to its inheritors? As research deepens, attention shifts toward the possibility that the disappearance of this ancient superpower was not a single historical event, but a multi-stage process involving functional decline, administrative fragmentation, and eventual cultural absorption. In this model, the system first loses synchronization between regions, then local adaptations begin to diverge. Finally, the original framework ceases to be operationally relevant, even if remnants persist in symbolic or structural form. But even this layered model leaves unanswered questions, because the peak coherence of the system remains difficult to explain. How did such a widely distributed structure maintain such precise standardization across vast distances without leaving behind clear evidence of centralized enforcement? Some researchers propose that the system may have relied on periodic reinforcement events, large-scale administrative recalibrations that resynchronized regional practices at intervals. If these events stopped, divergence would naturally accelerate. Others suggest that shared educational or institutional frameworks once ensured consistency, and that the breakdown of those frameworks led to gradual drift. But both explanations assume mechanisms that remain invisible in the archaeological record. And invisibility in this case is not neutral, it is itself part of the mystery. As comparative analysis expands, a troubling realization emerges. The more complete the regional datasets become, the more fragmented the overall picture appears. Each site individually suggests coherence, but when combined, the system resists full reconstruction. It is as if no single archive ever contained the complete structure, only partial views from different positions within it. And this fragmentation of perspective may be the key to understanding why the system has remained so elusive, because what survives is not a full civilization. It is a distributed echo of one. At this stage in the investigation, even the language used by researchers begins to shift. Terms like empire and kingdom are increasingly replaced with system, framework, or network, not because certainty has increased, but because older categories no longer adequately describe the evidence. And in that linguistic shift, a subtle but important change occurs. The object of study stops being something that ruled the ancient world and becomes something that structured it. Yet despite this growing conceptual clarity, the origin of that structure remains unknown. There is no identifiable founding moment, no clear emergence point, no single cultural cradle that explains its expansion. It appears already formed in the earliest detectable layers, and then it disappears in the later ones, leaving behind only fragments that no longer connect to their original architecture, as if the world once ran on a system that was never fully documented, only partially inherited, and eventually forgotten in its operational form. and that realization reframes everything that has been uncovered so far, because the mystery is no longer just about disappearance, it is about how something so widespread could become so untraceable in its final form. Without leaving a story that fully explains its own absence, the city was never supposed to be hidden this well. From the surface, it is nothing more than a low rise in the landscape, a subtle unevenness in the soil where erosion has behaved differently over time. But beneath that thin layer of earth lies something far more structured. Walls aligned with precision, foundations arranged in repeating geometric modules, streets that do not radiate organically from a centre, but instead follow a deliberately imposed grid that extends farther than the initial excavation permits. It is not the scale that is most unsettling, it is the familiarity, because this design matches fragments found hundreds of kilometres away, in places that were never supposed to share architectural identity. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first, the discovery is interpreted as a major administrative centre belonging to a known regional culture. The materials are consistent with local chronologies, pottery styles fit expected phases, tool marks align with regional metallurgical traditions, everything seems to confirm a localised origin, until the deeper layers are exposed. Below the expected settlement horizon, another architectural system appears, older, more uniform, more standardised. The transition between the two is not gradual. There is no visible evolutionary sequence in construction techniques. Instead, there is a sharp boundary where one system ends and another begins, and the lower system does not match the upper one in origin. It matches other distant sites. This is where the interpretation shifts again. Because what is being uncovered is not simply a city with a complex history. It is a site built on top of a pre-existing, regionally consistent infrastructural system that extends beyond the known cultural boundaries of the area. And this pattern is not isolated. Across multiple excavation zones, the same stratigraphic structure repeats, a localized cultural layer sitting atop a deeper, standardized architectural foundation, as if newer societies inherited not just land, but pre-existing systems whose origins they no longer fully understood. This introduces a difficult possibility that later civilizations may not have built their environments entirely from scratch, but instead adapted, reused, and partially erased earlier systemic infrastructures. In some cases, the lower layers include drainage systems and road networks that are too advanced for the upper cultural layer to have independently developed. Engineering consistency suggests knowledge that predates the societies currently associated with those regions, yet no textual records from those later cultures explicitly acknowledge the existence of such an earlier system. Instead, there are only indirect references, myths about old builders, legends of preceding works, ritual traditions tied to forgotten structures whose original function has been lost. These cultural echoes suggest inherited memory without inherited understanding. As excavation continues, another pattern emerges. The deeper infrastructural system is not uniform across the entire site. It appears in segments, sometimes interrupted by geological or cultural discontinuities, but always sharing the same design principles, standardized spacing, consistent material ratios, repeated structural motifs embedded in functional architecture. It resembles a system that was designed to be replicated rather than individually invented. And replication at this scale implies shared instructional coordination. But no instructional artifacts have been found in association with the deeper system. No foundational inscriptions, no explanatory texts, no dedicatory markers identifying builders or authorities responsible for construction. It is architecture without authorship, which is archaeologically rare and conceptually destabilizing. Because most known ancient systems, even highly distributed ones, leave behind identity markers. Even when political structures fade, cultural attribution usually persists in some form. Here, attribution is absent even at the deepest levels. The question becomes unavoidable. Who built this layer of civilization if no record of its builder survives? One hypothesis suggests that the deeper system may predate the cultural frameworks that later occupied the region, representing an earlier phase of coordinated development that was gradually absorbed and overwritten by subsequent societies. In this model, later civilizations inherit infrastructure without preserving knowledge of its origin. Another hypothesis proposes that the system was intentionally de-authored over time, that its identifying markers were systematically removed or replaced during later periods of cultural restructuring. Both possibilities introduce the idea of controlled historical layering, not just change over time, but modification of what is remembered. As analysis deepens, attention turns to material consistency. Stone sourcing studies reveal that materials used in the deeper architectural layer come from multiple geographically distant locations, yet they are processed in a way that suggests standardized treatment before construction. This implies either long-distance procurement systems or coordinated regional production protocols, but again, no central distribution network is visible in the archaeological record. And so the system appears both widespread and structurally unified, without a visible center of control. At another excavation point within the same site, researchers uncover a sealed chamber beneath the older architectural layer. Inside, there are no artifacts of daily life. Instead, there are fragments of construction models, miniature representations of architectural modules, arranged in precise configurations. These models suggest planning at a systemic scale, not for a single city, but for a repeating design applied across multiple locations. Yet even here, no inscriptions explain their purpose. The models exist without context, as if removed from a larger explanatory framework that no longer survives. What is most intriguing is that similar model fragments have been found in other distant sites, each slightly different in detail but following the same underlying structural logic. This suggests a shared design language. A language that is not linguistic, but architectural, and languages like that require transmission, some form of teaching, replication, or institutional continuity. But the mechanism of that transmission remains invisible. As researchers attempt to reconstruct the timeline, they notice something unexpected. The deeper system does not appear to evolve in a linear fashion. Instead, it appears fully formed in the earliest detectable layers. There are no earlier developmental stages, no experimental phases, no primitive precursors. It is complete from the beginning, and then, over time, it becomes fragmented. This reverses the usual expectation of technological and cultural development, where complexity increases gradually. Here, complexity appears suddenly, then decays. This inversion is one of the most difficult aspects of the evidence to interpret, because it suggests either a lost origin phase that has not yet been discovered, or a nonlinear model of cultural development that does not conform to known historical patterns. Meanwhile, the upper cultural layers continue to show increasing divergence from the underlying system. Local adaptations replace standardized designs, architectural modifications become region-specific, administrative traces become increasingly fragmented. The deeper system remains visible only in structure, not in function. It still exists, but it no longer operates. And this distinction becomes central to understanding the broader mystery. Because systems can persist physically long after they cease to function, and when that happens, interpretation becomes decoupled from reality. What remains is a world built upon forgotten foundations, where newer societies inhabit structures whose original logic has been lost, and the deeper question emerges once again, more sharply than before. If entire civilizations can be overwritten in place, without total destruction, then what else in the historical record represents continuity rather than origin? And how much of what is considered known history is actually the final layer of something far older, partially erased, and no longer recognized as a system at all? The excavation does not answer this. It only deepens the silence beneath it. The tablets do not break in the way stone is supposed to break. They fracture along lines that suggest deliberate pressure, not accidental decay. Edges are too clean, too controlled, as if the material was separated with intention rather than time. And when the fragments are reconstructed across multiple excavation sites, a pattern begins to emerge that is far more disturbing than any single artifact on its own. The same administrative sequence appears again and again, but never complete in one place. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first, this is interpreted as a preservation issue. Ancient archives are rarely recovered intact. Flooding, fire, and burial conditions often scatter records across regions. But as the dataset expands, the fragmentation itself becomes statistically suspicious. Entire sequences of administrative documentation are consistently split across distant sites in a way that does not match natural dispersal patterns. Instead of random loss, there is structured distribution. It is as if the records were intentionally divided and then moved. This idea introduces a new layer to the mystery. If the ancient superpower truly existed as a coordinated system, then its records may not have been lost at all. They may have been relocated, divided among successor regions, or deliberately dispersed to prevent any single reconstruction of the whole system. Such a strategy would imply an advanced understanding of historical control, not just governance of space, but governance of memory. And memory, once fragmented, becomes nearly impossible to reassemble. In one excavation zone, a sealed archive chamber is discovered beneath a collapsed administrative complex. The chamber contains rows of clay tablets arranged in orderly stacks, but each stack contains only partial sequences. No single stack preserves a complete narrative. Instead, each one contains overlapping fragments of different administrative cycles. When compared across sites, these fragments align like pieces of a larger puzzle, but the puzzle is distributed across geography. This raises a critical question. If these fragments were intentionally distributed, what was the purpose of preventing a complete record from surviving in any single location? One interpretation is security. Centralized knowledge systems are vulnerable. If a single archive is captured or destroyed, the entire administrative structure can be compromised. Distributed record-keeping would mitigate this risk, ensuring that no single point of failure could erase the system entirely. Another interpretation is more subtle. Fragmentation may have been a form of control over interpretation itself. If no single archive contained the full picture, then no single authority could reconstruct or challenge the system's historical narrative. In this model, knowledge is not just preserved, it is managed through controlled incompleteness. As analysis deepens, researchers begin to notice that the fragmented tablets share a consistent structural logic. Even when separated by vast distances, they follow identical formatting rules. Line spacing, symbol placement, and numerical structures remain standardized across all recovered fragments. This consistency suggests a shared administrative protocol governing record creation. But again, no central institution responsible for enforcing this protocol has been identified. Instead, the system appears embedded everywhere and nowhere at the same time. At another site, a different kind of discovery complicates the interpretation further. A series of tablets is found that appear to be deliberately overwritten. Earlier inscriptions have been partially erased and replaced with newer administrative entries, but the erasure is not complete. Under certain lighting conditions, traces of the original text remain visible beneath the later layers. This palimpsest effect reveals something crucial. The underlying text follows the same standardized system observed in other regions, but the overwriting belongs to a different cultural phase. This suggests a transition not just of administration, but of narrative authority. One system replaces another in the same physical space, but does not fully erase it. Instead, it overlays it, and overlaying history is fundamentally different from replacing it. Because layers imply coexistence, even if one becomes dominant. As more examples of overwritten tablets are discovered, a pattern emerges. The older standardized system is consistently associated with regions of high infrastructural integration corridors, storage networks, and standardized architecture. The newer layers correspond to more localized cultural expressions, with reduced structural uniformity. This suggests a gradual shift from systemic coordination to regional autonomy. But the transition is not uniform. Some regions preserve older systems longer, others transition earlier, and some show prolonged periods of hybridization, where both systems coexist in modified form. This uneven timeline reinforces the idea that the collapse or transformation of the ancient superpower was not a singular event, but a staggered process unfolding differently across geography. Yet even within this complexity, certain questions remain unresolved. Why does the older system appear so coherent across such vast distances in its peak phase? And why does it fragment so cleanly afterward, without leaving behind a clear explanatory narrative? One possibility is that the system relied on periodic synchronization events, moments when administrative standards were recalibrated across regions. If such events ceased, divergence would naturally accelerate, eventually leading to fragmentation. Another possibility is that the system depended on shared institutional training frameworks that gradually decayed. As knowledge transmission weakened, consistency would erode over generations. But neither explanation accounts for the near-perfect uniformity observed in early layers. That level of consistency suggests a level of integration that is difficult to achieve without highly centralized coordination or an equally powerful distributed synchronization mechanism. And no such mechanism has been identified in the archaeological record. As research continues, attention shifts to linguistic traces embedded within the fragmented tablets. While the symbols vary across regions, certain structural elements remain constant. Numerical sequences, administrative classifications, and formulaic expressions appear repeatedly, suggesting a shared cognitive framework underlying the system. This is not just administrative consistency, it is conceptual consistency. A shared way of organizing information that transcends local linguistic differences. And that implies more than trade or influence. It implies systemic integration at the level of thought structure. Yet even here, the origin remains elusive. There is no identifiable moment when this system first appears in the record. No developmental phase showing gradual emergence from simpler forms. It enters history fully formed, already complex, already standardized, already distributed. And then it fades, as if it had always been there, and then simply stopped being maintained. At one inland archive site, researchers uncover what appears to be a final administrative layer. The tablets in this layer show increasing irregularity, with symbols deviating from standard forms. Some entries are incomplete, others appear hastily recorded. A few contain annotations that suggest confusion or uncertainty among scribes. This final layer is not a collapse. It is a deterioration of precision, and precision is the foundation of any large-scale administrative system. When precision fails, coherence follows. Eventually, synchronization breaks entirely, and what remains is fragmentation. But fragmentation does not erase existence, it only obscures structure, and as the fragments continue to surface across regions, the possibility becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. That what is being reconstructed is not a lost empire in the traditional sense, but the remnants of a once coordinated system that dissolved across time, geography, and memory, leaving behind evidence that is real, but incomplete enough to resist full understanding, and perhaps that is the most persistent feature of all, not disappearance, but incompleteness. The climate record does not speak in language, but it remembers patterns. Deep cores extracted from ancient lake beds and dried river basins begin to show a sequence of environmental instability that overlaps in unsettling proximity. With the gradual fragmentation of the standardized system, layers of sediment reveal alternating periods of moisture abundance and prolonged drought, shifts in vegetation cover, and subtle temperature oscillations that would have directly affected agricultural output. At first glance, this seems like a familiar explanation. Civilizations rise and fall with climate stress, but the alignment here is not clean enough to support a simple cause and effect narrative. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, in several regions, environmental stress appears after the first signs of administrative fragmentation rather than before it. In others, the system remains coherent even through significant climatic instability. This uneven relationship complicates any attempt to reduce the collapse of the ancient superpower to environmental determinism alone. Instead, what emerges is a more complex interaction. Climate does not appear to initiate the breakdown, but it may have accelerated a process already underway. In archaeological terms, this distinction is critical because it shifts responsibility away from a single external trigger and toward a deeper structural vulnerability within the system itself. One of the most important discoveries in this phase comes from isotopic analysis of agricultural residues found across multiple regions. The data shows that food production systems were highly standardized during the peak of the network's coherence. Irrigation methods, crop selection, and seasonal planting cycles appear to follow synchronized patterns across vast distances. This level of coordination suggests a shared agricultural framework, not just similar environmental adaptation, but deliberate alignment. However, as time progresses, this synchronization weakens, crop diversity increases, irrigation systems become more regionally adapted, seasonal cycles begin to diverge, agriculture, once tightly integrated, gradually localizes, and this agricultural decentralization mirrors the broader administrative fragmentation observed in seals, tablets, and architectural systems. The system is unraveling at multiple levels simultaneously, but not uniformly. Some regions retain synchronized agricultural practices longer than others. These regions often correspond to areas with stronger infrastructural remnants, corridor networks, standardized storage facilities, and administrative hubs. This suggests that infrastructure and coordination were deeply interconnected. When one weakens, the other follows. Yet even this does not fully explain the pattern of decline, because environmental data also shows regional anomalies that do not align with systemic fragmentation. Certain areas experience severe drought without losing administrative coherence, while others maintain stable environmental conditions yet still undergo rapid systemic divergence. This inconsistency suggests that climate stress alone cannot account for the observed breakdown. Instead, it may have acted as a stress multiplier within an already fragile system. At another excavation site, researchers uncover a sequence of abandoned irrigation channels that provide further insight into this process. The channels are engineered with remarkable precision, consistent with earlier standardized systems, but in later phases, they are modified repeatedly in localized ways, often reducing efficiency in favor of immediate usability. This suggests a shift in priorities, from systemic optimization to local survival. And such shifts are often the first visible signs of larger structural transformation. As regional autonomy increases, coordination costs rise. Systems that once relied on shared scheduling and resource distribution begin to fragment into localized decision-making units. Over time, this reduces the need for standardized frameworks, accelerating their abandonment. But what remains unclear is why this transition occurred so broadly and so consistently across distant regions. Because independent systems do not typically fail in synchrony unless they are linked by a shared dependency, and identifying that dependency has become one of the central challenges of the investigation. Some researchers propose that the ancient superpower may have relied on centralized redistribution networks for essential resources. If those networks failed, local systems would naturally shift toward autonomy. However, no definitive evidence of a singular redistribution center has been found. Others suggest that communication breakdown alone could explain the fragmentation. If long-distance coordination relied on periodic synchronization events, then disruptions to those events could cascade into systemic divergence. But again, no direct evidence of such communication infrastructure has been preserved. What remains is indirect inference based on pattern alignment, and patterns alone are not sufficient to reconstruct full systems. As environmental and administrative data are compared, a subtle but important correlation emerges. Regions with the earliest signs of systemic fragmentation also show earlier shifts in settlement mobility. Populations begin to move more frequently, abandoning large coordinated centers in favor of smaller, more adaptable communities. This mobility reflects changing survival strategies, but it also disrupts institutional continuity, because large-scale systems depend on stable populations to maintain administrative consistency. When populations move, knowledge transmission weakens, and standardized practices become harder to sustain. At one site, a sequence of habitation layers shows this transition clearly. Early layers contain densely organized settlement structures aligned with broader regional systems. Middle layers show partial abandonment of these structures, replaced by smaller and more flexible dwellings. Upper layers show fully localized habitation patterns with no evidence of integration into larger networks. And again, there is no evidence of violent disruption, only adaptation. Another line of evidence comes from botanical analysis. Pollen samples reveal gradual shifts in cultivated species over time. Highly standardized agricultural crops decline, replaced by more diverse and locally resilient varieties. This diversification suggests a move away from coordinated agricultural planning toward decentralized food production strategies. Such changes are consistent with systemic fragmentation, but they do not explain its origin. As the data accumulates, researchers begin to consider a more fundamental possibility that the ancient superpower may have been inherently dependent on a level of environmental and logistical stability that was difficult to sustain over long periods. In this model, the system was not designed to collapse, but it was not designed to endure indefinite variability either. Instead, it functioned optimally within a narrow range of conditions. When those conditions shifted gradually, unevenly, and across multiple domains, the system began to lose coherence. This would explain the absence of a single collapse event, because there was no single failure point, only gradual misalignment across interdependent systems. Administrative structures, agricultural frameworks, infrastructural networks, and communication pathways all began to drift out of synchronization at different rates, and once synchronization is lost, recovery becomes increasingly difficult, even if individual components remain functional. because systems are defined not only by their parts, but by their coordination. As excavation continues, one of the most revealing patterns emerges from the comparison of early and late infrastructural usage. Corridor networks, once heavily used for coordination and distribution, show declining traffic over time, storage facilities become underutilized, administrative hubs lose relevance, yet none of these structures are destroyed. They are simply abandoned, left intact, but unused. An abandoned infrastructure is one of the clearest indicators of systemic transformation rather than catastrophic destruction. It suggests that the system was not forced out of existence, but gradually replaced by something more localized, more flexible, and less dependent on large-scale coordination. Still, this does not resolve the deeper question. Because even if environmental stress, mobility, and decentralization explain the fragmentation, they do not explain the original emergence of such a highly coordinated system across such vast distances. That remains the most persistent anomaly, a civilization that appears fully integrated at its peak, and then dissolves without leaving a clear narrative of its own origin or end, leaving only traces embedded in climate data, settlement patterns, and infrastructural remnants that no longer align into a single coherent story. And beneath all of it, the same unresolved tension remains. Between what the Earth remembers and what history has forgotten, the artifact is not large enough to attract attention on its own. A thin slab of baked clay, fractured along one edge, half buried in sediment that once formed the floor of a storage chamber, yet when it is lifted and cleaned, the surface reveals something that immediately distinguishes it from the surrounding material culture. The markings are not local. They are not even regionally consistent with anything previously catalogued from the upper layers of the site. They belong to the deeper system, the one that predates everything above it. And yet, they appear here, in a context that should have been entirely disconnected from that earlier framework. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first, the discovery is treated as contamination, a displaced object from a lower stratum, possibly introduced through later disturbance or structural collapse. But as the excavation continues, more fragments emerge from the same layer, not clustered in one location, but dispersed across the site in a pattern that suggests deliberate placement rather than accidental intrusion. The deeper system is not just beneath this settlement, it is embedded within it. This realization forces a re-evaluation of the entire stratigraphic model that has guided interpretation up to this point. The assumption that cultural layers represent clean, sequential replacement begins to break down. Instead, what appears is a more complex relationship between systems overlapping, interwoven, and in some cases preserved within later cultural frameworks without clear acknowledgement of origin. The implication is difficult to ignore. The ancient superpower may not have disappeared in a simple linear sequence of decline and replacement. It may have been absorbed. In archaeology, absorption is harder to identify than destruction. Destruction leaves clear markers, burn layers, collapsed debris, abrupt abandonment. Absorption leaves continuity of space but discontinuity of meaning. Structures remain, but their function is reinterpreted. Symbols persist, but their original significance is lost or transformed. And this is exactly what the evidence now suggests. In multiple excavation zones, deeper infrastructural elements associated with the standardized system are found integrated into later settlements, not rebuilt, but reused. Corridors become foundations for new structures. Storage systems are repurposed. Architectural grids are followed even when their original administrative logic is no longer understood. This creates a paradox. The system is gone, but its structure remains operational in modified form. One of the most compelling examples comes from a multi-layered urban site where successive cultural phases are clearly distinguishable. The earliest phase shows full integration into the standardized system uniform architecture, consistent administrative artifacts, and coordinated infrastructure. The middle phase shows partial retention of these systems alongside increasing local variation. The final phase shows complete localization, but still retains the underlying structural layout of the earlier system. The city changes its identity, but not its skeleton. This suggests that later societies did not build over empty ground. They inherited a landscape already shaped by a prior system, whose logic they no longer fully understood but continued to use. And once a system becomes invisible as a system, it becomes infrastructure. At another site, researchers uncover evidence of ritual practices centered around remnants of earlier administrative structures. Seals are no longer used for bureaucratic validation, but are incorporated into symbolic or ceremonial contexts. Corridor entrances are marked as sacred thresholds. Architectural features once designed for coordination become embedded in local cosmologies. This transformation is crucial, because it shows how functional systems become cultural memory. And cultural memory is not stable. It evolves, distorts, and reinterprets over time. What was once an administrative network becomes mythology. What was once coordination becomes symbolism, and what was once structure becomes story. As this reinterpretation spreads across regions, the original function of the system becomes increasingly obscured. Later texts reference ancient builders or earlier orderings, but these references are vague, often metaphorical, and inconsistent across cultures. There is no unified memory of what the system actually was, only fragments of interpretation. Meanwhile, in the material record, something more subtle is happening. The deeper system is no longer actively maintained, but its components continue to influence settlement patterns. Roads align with older corridors. Agricultural zones follow earlier irrigation logic. Even settlement spacing reflects residual adherence to underlying structural principles. This persistence suggests that the system's influence outlived its operational existence, a kind of structural afterlife. Not remembered as identity, but continued as form. Researchers begin to refer to this phenomenon cautiously as embedded continuity, the idea that once a large-scale system reaches sufficient integration into physical and social infrastructure, it cannot be fully erased without complete environmental reset. Instead, it decays into residual patterns that persist independently of cultural awareness. But even this concept does not fully resolve the deeper mystery, because embedded continuity explains persistence, not origin, and not disappearance. The question remains, how did such a system arise in the first place without leaving a clearly traceable developmental trajectory? No gradual build-up, no experimental precursors, no transitional forms that clearly lead into the standardized peak phase. It appears already complete in its earliest detectable form. This absence of developmental origin remains one of the most persistent anomalies in the entire dataset. At one excavation zone, a sealed archive chamber provides a rare glimpse into the final stages of systemic transition. Inside are fragmented records that appear to span multiple administrative cycles. Early entries show strict standardization. Later entries become increasingly irregular. Some contain annotations that suggest confusion among record keepers about changing protocols. One fragment is particularly striking. It references local adaptation of former standards, suggesting that by this point, the system was already being reinterpreted rather than actively enforced. Another fragment refers to dispersal of central coordination. Though the wording is ambiguous and may reflect translation uncertainty, there is no direct explanation of what caused this dispersal, only acknowledgement that it had occurred. This is one of the few moments where the system is described in transition rather than inference, and even here, clarity is limited. As researchers attempt to synthesize these findings, a broader interpretive model begins to take shape. The ancient superpower may have functioned less as a political empire and more as a systemic overlay, a coordinating framework that operated across multiple societies, standardizing certain functions without fully replacing local identities. In such a model, disappearance does not require collapse, it requires disengagement. Once coordination ceases, the system does not fall, it dissolves into its constituent parts, and those parts continue independently, often without awareness of their shared origin. This would explain the fragmented nature of the archaeological record. It would also explain why no single narrative of collapse exists in surviving texts. Different regions experience different timelines of disengagement, resulting in multiple partial memories rather than a unified historical account. Yet even this model leaves unresolved tensions, because the scale of coordination observed in the peak phase still implies a level of integration that is difficult to achieve without a strong organizing principle, and that principle remains unidentified. It is absent from inscriptions, absent from architecture, absent from myth in any coherent form, and yet its effects are everywhere, in the alignment of ancient infrastructure, in the repetition of administrative patterns, in the subtle echoes of standardized systems embedded within later cultural frameworks. It is as if the system did not simply disappear. It unstitched itself from the world it once organized, leaving behind a landscape that still carries its geometry but no longer remembers its design. And in that silence, the final question becomes unavoidable. Not what this civilization was, but how something so deeply embedded in the structure of the ancient world could become so completely unrecognizable as a unified whole. The deepest layer is not where the answers begin, it is where the assumptions finally stop working. Beneath the last confirmed cultural horizon, where even the most confident chronological frameworks begin to lose precision, the excavation reaches a level that feels less like history and more like compression. Soil here is denser, older, and strangely uniform across wide distances, as if time itself had settled into a stable equilibrium long before the first recognizable settlements appeared above it. And within this layer, something unexpected appears again. Not ruins, not artifacts in the usual sense, but repetition. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Fragments of standardized patterns re-emerge in contexts that should predate their existence entirely. Not identical in form, but identical in logic. Spatial organization, geometric alignment, proportional consistency. The same structural intelligence appears, stripped of cultural identity, reduced to pure architectural grammar. It is as if the system is not confined to a single historical phase. It is embedded deeper than that. In multiple sites across different regions, this basal layer shows recurring signs of intentional shaping. Not random geological formation, not natural stratification, but consistent structuring of space that resembles early-stage planning, as though the ground itself had been organized before later civilizations ever arrived. This interpretation is controversial, and it must remain cautious. There is no consensus that such deep layers represent cultural activity. Some researchers argue that these patterns can be explained by natural sediment processes, pressure shifts, or geological regularities that mimic human organization. But the consistency is difficult to dismiss entirely, because the same structural signatures appear in geographically separated sites that share no known environmental connection. And that raises a question that the field has been approaching for some time, but has rarely stated directly. What if the system being studied did not begin where human history begins? What if it extends deeper into prehistory than any identifiable civilization? At this level of interpretation, the distinction between archaeology and system analysis begins to blur. The focus is no longer on cultures, but on patterns of organisation that appear repeatedly across time, regardless of who or what produced them, and those patterns persist. One of the most significant discoveries in this layer is a sequence of aligned subterranean formations that do not correspond to known settlement behaviour. These formations are not defensive, they are not residential, they do not serve obvious economic or ritual purposes. Instead, they appear to function as a distributed structural framework embedded across large geographic areas. The spacing between these formations is unusually consistent. The orientation aligns with broader regional grids observed in upper layers. Even when separated by natural barriers such as rivers or elevation changes, the structural logic remains intact. This suggests coordination at a scale that transcends local geography, but there is no evidence of the cultural mechanisms that would typically support such coordination. No writing system, no identifiable administrative artifacts, no clear technological progression leading into it. Instead, it appears fully formed in its earliest detectable manifestation, and then it vanishes upward into later history, leaving only fragments. This inversion of expectation complexity appearing before simplicity is one of the most difficult aspects of the entire dataset. It challenges the assumption that systems evolve gradually from simple to complex over time. Instead, it suggests that complexity may emerge in bursts, or that earlier stages of development have simply not been preserved or recognised. Some researchers propose that the basal layer may represent a natural template in the environment that later human systems adapted to. In this view, geography itself imposes structural constraints that naturally produce repeating patterns of organisation. Human civilizations then build upon these constraints, creating the appearance of continuity where none actually exists. But this explanation struggles to account for the precision observed in the alignment of structures across distant regions. Others suggest that this layer may represent a lost cultural phase so ancient that it predates all known historical frameworks, possibly belonging to a pre-civilizational society whose traces have been almost entirely overwritten by later developments. This hypothesis remains speculative, but it cannot be dismissed entirely given the consistency of the evidence. As excavation continues, another pattern emerges that complicates interpretation further. In some locations, the basal structures appear to influence later settlement layouts in subtle but persistent ways. Even when later cultures are unaware of the deeper layer, their building patterns often align with its geometry. This suggests that the deeper system exerts a form of structural persistence across time, not through memory, but through spatial inheritance. A landscape that retains organisational logic long after its original designers are gone. At one particularly revealing site, researchers uncover a vertical sequence of occupation that spans multiple phases. The lowest layer shows the deep structural pattern. Above it, early cultural settlements begin to align loosely with that pattern. Higher layers show more defined cultural systems that fully integrate the underlying geometry into their own planning. And finally, the uppermost layers show localized divergence from that original structure. This creates a rare stratigraphic narrative, not of replacement, but of gradual reinterpretation of a pre-existing framework, and that reinterpretation continues until the original logic is no longer consciously recognized. It becomes invisible not because it is absent, but because it has been absorbed into default behavior. This realization forces a re-evaluation of earlier assumptions about the so-called ancient superpower. If its traces extend deeper than identifiable civilization layers, then it may not represent a single historical entity at all. It may represent a long-duration structural phenomenon that predates and outlasts individual cultures. In this model, what archaeologists have been calling an empire may actually be the most recent expression of a much older organizing principle, one that manifests differently across time, depending on the societies that interact with it. This would explain the lack of clear origin points, because there may be no single origin in the conventional sense, only recurring emergence of the same organizational logic in different historical contexts. But even this idea raises further questions. If the system is not tied to a specific civilization, then what sustains its consistency across such vast distances and time periods? Some propose that environmental constraints alone could produce these patterns. Others argue for cognitive universals in human organization that naturally lead to similar structural solutions. But neither explanation fully accounts for the scale and precision observed, and so the mystery deepens again. At this level of analysis, the distinction between cultural history and structural persistence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The deeper layer suggests something that is not simply built by civilizations, but shared across them in ways that are not fully understood, as if each society is not starting from nothing, but inheriting a partially structured world and gradually reinterpreting it through their own frameworks. This reframes the entire investigation. Because if the system predates identifiable civilization layers, then its disappearance is not a matter of collapse. It is a matter of loss of recognition, a shift from functional structure to unrecognized background, from system to landscape. And once that shift occurs, reconstruction becomes nearly impossible, because what is no longer recognized as a system can no longer be studied as one. It becomes invisible by definition, and that invisibility may be the most enduring legacy of all. Not erasure, but transformation into something so foundational that it disappears from conscious understanding, leaving only traces that hint at deeper order that once connected them all. The final chamber is not marked by ceremony, inscription, or any of the architectural signals that usually accompany places of importance in the ancient world. It is marked only by absence. The corridor leading into it narrows gradually, not through collapse or erosion, but through deliberate design. The stonework becomes smoother, more uniform, until even the tool marks disappear entirely. At a certain point, the geometry stops feeling like construction and begins to feel like continuity, as if the passage was not built into the earth, but drawn out of it, and then the chamber opens. Before going further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, inside, there are no statues, no records, no obvious administrative materials. Instead, the space is defined by proportion alone, walls aligned with precise symmetry, angles that repeat earlier structural patterns from distant sites, a spatial logic that feels familiar without being directly identifiable, and in the centre, something even more unusual, a layered arrangement of fragments, not assembled like an archive, but distributed like a system that was never meant to be read from a single position. Each fragment belongs to a different phase of the same long sequence that has been traced across all previous sections of excavation. Administrative seals, corridor markers, tablet fragments, architectural diagrams, agricultural records, all reduced, broken, or incomplete, yet arranged here in a way that suggests intentional convergence. This is not storage, it is synthesis. For the first time in the entire investigation, the system is not being inferred from scattered evidence, it is being presented as structure. But even here, clarity does not arrive in the form of explanation. There is no text that identifies origin, purpose, or authority. No founding declaration, no collapse record, no narrative of transition, only fragments arranged in spatial relationships that imply meaning without stating it. And that absence is the final confirmation of a pattern that has been building across all previous layers of discovery. The ancient superpower, if it can still be called that, was never preserved as a single historical story. It survives only as distributed structure, a system that existed not in one place, but in the relationships between places, not in one moment, but across repeated synchronization events that no longer exist in the record. And not in memory, but in residual organization embedded in landscape, architecture, and administrative fragments that outlived their original function. As researchers carefully document the chamber, a realization begins to settle in. Every layer uncovered before this point was never truly separate. The corridors, the seals, the administrative tablets, the agricultural systems, the climate correlations, the overwritten archives, the fragmented cities, and even the basal structural layer beneath all known occupation phases were not independent discoveries. They were partial views of the same underlying pattern, a pattern that never existed as a single object, but as a distributed system of coordination that shaped multiple levels of human organization simultaneously. And when coordination ends, what remains is not absence, it is disassembly, slow, uneven, and geographically dispersed, which is why no single collapse event could ever be found, because there was never a single point of failure, only gradual separation of interconnected parts. In the final analysis, what has been called an ancient superpower does not behave like a conventional empire, kingdom, or civilization. It behaves like an organizing layer that once connected multiple societies into a shared structural framework without erasing their local identities entirely. A system that operated through alignment rather than domination, through synchronization rather than conquest, through shared standards rather than visible rule. And because of that, its disappearance does not resemble destruction. It resembles desynchronization. Once synchronization breaks, each part continues independently, gradually adapting to local conditions, slowly losing awareness of the larger structure it once participated in. And over time, even memory of that participation fades, not because it is erased, but because it is no longer functionally meaningful. What remains in the archaeological record, then, is not the story of a lost empire in the traditional sense. It is the fossilization of a coordination system that once connected the ancient world in ways that are still only partially understood. Its corridors remain, but no longer connect in meaning. Its seals remain, but no longer authenticate a shared authority. Its cities remain, but no longer recognize the same structural logic that once shaped them. And its records remain only as fragments, distributed across space and time, impossible to fully reconstruct from any single point of view. The most unsettling conclusion is not that something was lost. It is that what was lost may never have been localized enough to be fully remembered in the first place. Because systems that exist everywhere are also systems that can disappear everywhere at once, without ever producing a single identifiable moment of disappearance. Only a gradual fading of coherence, until the world no longer recognizes that it is looking at fragments of a single structure, and treats them instead as isolated stories, unconnected, independent, incomplete. As the final chamber falls into silence, what remains is not an answer, but a perspective shift that cannot be undone. That history is not only made of events, but also of systems that once organized those events into coherence, and when those systems dissolve, the events remain, but the meaning between them disappears, leaving behind a world that still carries the shape of something it can no longer fully see, and that is where the investigation finally ends, not with discovery of a lost empire, but with recognition of a lost framework that once made empires intelligible at all.